I've been saying that the rally in Tulsa tonight is going to be the biggest gathering in the world in the time of coronavirus, but actually there's a bigger gathering today. It's just not going to be in a hall with 19,000 people. The Poor People's Campaign is holding a virtual march today to bring attention to poverty and racial injustice. The march, modeled after Reverend Martin Luther King's last organizing event in 1968, will live stream speakers talking about living in poverty in some of the nation's most rural and deindustrialized areas. For too long, the accepted thinking has been that fixing poverty or education or health care would cost too much. But since the 2008 financial crisis, we've seen that we do have the resources to spend. I spoke to Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote a book called The Price of Inequality about this very topic.
Obviously, there are limited resources, but the point is what we do with those resources is a matter of choice. And there are enough resources for us to deal with the major problems. If we wanted to win the war on poverty, we could win that war. If we wanted to win the war to have a safe environment, we could win that war. So it's not the lack of resources, it's the lack of political will, the wrong prioritization.
With a country in a recession right now, we aren't likely to see poverty decrease anytime soon. We know we've got the money to solve these problems for the long term, so why aren't we choosing to use those resources to end poverty? With me now is the Reverend Dr. William Barber and Reverend Liz Theoharis, who are leading today's event. Thank you for doing this and letting me be involved in it, to both of you. Reverend Dr. Barber, let me start with you. The argument that it's too expensive to fix this, as we've just discussed, doesn't hold water, but it requires a shift in our mentality about how poverty is solved. We've thought about it as charity. We've thought about it as throwing good money over after bad. What is that shift required to get us to solve this problem once and for all?
Well, we have to, first of all, stop lying about the scarcity and tell the truth that we have all the money we need. Secondly, we have to loose ourselves from this neoliberalism argument that if you fix folk at the top, it fixes things with just the middle class, and realize if you lift from the bottom. And then we have to realize that it costs more for poverty to exist than for us to fix it. Right now, if we instituted a $15 minimum wage, for instance, we could automatically lift 49 million people up out of poverty and low wealth and pump $328 billion into the economy. If we did a housing wage, we could lift 83 million people up out of poverty and low wealth and pump millions of dollars into the economy. One of the things we have been doing is we've been doing measurements on this valley, and what we've found out is it costs more. It costs more in terms of economics, and it costs more in lives. We could save lives, and we could save the economy if we would lift from the bottom and fix poverty. And that's why today we have more than 200 Facebook streams that are going out already, nearly 150, 160,000 people who have RSVP'd and said, look, we're going to be a part of this mass movement, this mass people's assembly tomorrow march on Washington today, digitally.
And I'm going to be one of those people streaming it today. Reverend Theoharis, we have a health crisis in this country. We've got a social justice crisis in this country, and they are inextricably linked to poverty. If we had fewer people in poverty, if people earned a living wage, which so many millions of Americans don't, it would contribute to social justice. It would contribute to fewer people dying of coronavirus.
This is so true. I mean, what we know is that there are 62 million people who make less than a living wage in this country. If those folks made a living wage, then people wouldn't have had to go to work sick with the coronavirus, infect others. What we know is we have 11 million people who are homeless in this country. So when they were told to shelter in place and had no place to shelter, all that happened was that the inequalities or the fissures that spread this pandemic even farther, that have caused that the U.S. has more deaths from this virus than any other nation in the world, despite paying more for health care. It doesn't have to be this way. We could invest in public education. We could invest in health care. We could raise the living wages. And we could therefore not just be more equipped as a nation to handle this pandemic, we could improve lives for the majority of people in this nation. Just one military contract would pay for expanding Medicaid in 14 states across the country. So you can't say that we don't have the resources to do it. Right now, we have a lack of political will. And so that's why people are rising up together in the thousands, in the millions today as a part of the mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. Folks can find it online, and please join us in this fight for justice for everyone.
Reverend Dr. Barber, when you add up what it would cost to give everybody a $15 minimum wage or to get rid of college debt, the numbers, they pale in comparison to what we have spent in the last few months in emergency aid. But one of the things, I want to put a map up to show where poverty exists in this country. And a lot of the states which have poverty rates of 17% and higher are rural. So how do we deal with that particular problem? Look at those darker colored states, the deep purple and the slightly lighter purple. How do we deal with job assistance, health care, education, training to uplift the rural and deindustrial parts of this country?
Yeah, and now let me just say, we gave 84% of the money that we spent on the first three bills responding to coronavirus to corporations, and not to poor people and to people who are working and to people who didn't have health insurance and sick leave. And we also know that the money is in our military. As Liz said, if we cut one military budget, we could actually provide 945,000 jobs in fixing infrastructure, and a lot of it would be in rural areas. But look at that map again. Let me just go a little deeper. It's rural, but it's also southern. And let me connect it to systemic racism. Yeah. Every one of those states that has the highest poverty rates are also the states with the most voter suppression. So what happens in those states, people get elected through racist voter suppression. They use race to get elected, race to divide people. Then they get elected, and watch this. Once they get elected, they block health care, they block living wages, they block the things that would lift people out of poverty, and they hurt mostly white people in raw numbers. Mostly black people in percentage, mostly white people in raw numbers, which proves then that racism is targeted at black people, but is ultimately against democracy and all people. So we have to have a new political imagination. We have to expand the electorate. Every one of those states you showed, if you organize poor and low wealth black people, brown people, and white people around an agenda, they can fundamentally shift the political calculus. That's why our purpose of our assembly today is to first put a face on this problem. It's to show everyday people who dealt with it, but also to build power. We're changing the narrative, building power, registering people for an agenda who vote, because we can fundamentally shift the South, the rural areas, black and white people working together, and brown people. And we are seeing that beginning to happen. A party is not going to do it. A movement has to do it. And when we do that, we can change the country. And that's what we're focusing on in this movement.
So I want to remind everybody out there who's been participating in these demonstrations for social justice that today is a big one. You don't even need to leave your home to do it. Reverend Dr. William Barber and Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis are the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign. Thank you for what you're doing. I am involved in this, and you can see it on my Facebook page as well. But you can watch the National Call for Moral Revival starting at 10 a.m. Eastern and again at 6 p.m. Go to June2020.org. Do that today.